Imagine a temple, not a ruin, not a photograph in a textbook, a living, breathing temple, torchlit, incense-heavy, draped in lapis lazuli and hammered gold. Crowds pressing through its gates not as criminals, not as the desperate, but as the devout, as the faithful, as worshippers who believed with every fiber of their being that what they were about to do inside those walls was holy. Now imagine a young woman standing at the threshold of that same temple. She did not choose to be here. She was sold. Her family owed a debt. The creditor accepted her in place of silver. And now the system, the sacred, state-sanctioned, priest-approved system, has given her a new title. Not slave. Something far more unsettling, something that wears the mask of dignity to hide what it actually is. What do you do with a civilization that turned exploitation into theology? What do you do with a world where the line between worship and degradation was not just blurred, it was erased, consecrated and placed on an altar? And what do you do with a God who looked at that world and said, enough, not in rage, not in the heat of a single moment, but after centuries of patience, after generations of warnings, after sending voice after voice into the dust and the heat of that ancient world, each one saying the same thing in a different tongue. This is not what you were made for. You were made for something higher than this. In this exploration, we will not look away. We will walk through the gates of Babylon, not to be shocked, but to understand what kind of spiritual architecture a civilization builds when it confuses the sacred with the carnal, to understand why the contrast between that world and the world the Bible called Israel into was not a matter of cultural preference, but of life and death, of freedom and bondage, of dignity and the systematic erasure of it, because the idols changed their names, but the hunger behind them never did. Prepare yourself to see what the surface never explains. There is a city. It sits between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in a valley so flat that from a distance it seems to rise out of the earth like a dream or a fever. Its name, in the oldest layers of memory, means something like Gate of the Gods, Babylon, or before Babylon, Sumer, Akkad, Ur. The names shift across the millennia, but the civilization pulses beneath them all like a single enormous heartbeat. This is the world the Bible enters. This is the world into which Abraham was born and from which he was called to leave. To understand what Abraham left, you must first understand what he was leaving behind. Not a primitive culture, not a barbaric collection of mud huts and superstition. Quite the opposite. The civilization of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley was, by the standards of the ancient world, breathtaking in its sophistication. It had writing, cuneiform pressed into clay tablets, when much of the world was still communicating through marks on stone. It had law codes. It had mathematics precise enough to track celestial movements across centuries. It had medicine, commerce, diplomacy. It had a literature so rich that its stories of floods and creation would resonate with the oldest chapters of Genesis in ways that scholars would spend lifetimes trying to untangle. It also had its gods, and its gods were hungry. The Mesopotamian pantheon was not a collection of distant abstract forces. These were gods who interfered, who demanded, who could be appeased and could be offended. Anu was the sky. Enlil was the wind and the storm. Ea was wisdom and the deep waters. And above all of them, woven through the daily life of every marketplace and every household, was Ishtar, the goddess of love, the goddess of war, the goddess of fertility, a figure of terrifying power and mercurial temperament, as likely to destroy the man who loved her as to bless him with abundance. Ishtar did not live only in the high heavens of theology. She lived in the temples. And the temples were everywhere, in cities like Ur, Nippur, Uruk, Nineveh. The ziggurat, that stepped pyramid of brick and mortar reaching toward the sky, was not merely a religious monument. It was the economic and civic center of the city. The temple administered grain, the temple managed land, the temple kept the records, disbursed the loans, adjudicated the disputes. The temple was the state. And woven into this vast administrative structure, integrated into its theology and its economy simultaneously, was a system that the ancient world accepted without question and that modern sensibility struggles to fully grasp. The institution of sacred sexuality. The names for these women varied across time and region. In Sumerian, the term was New Gig. In Akkadian, the Kadishtu. In Hebrew, the same root gives us Kedusha, a word that appears in the Torah with the weight of a prohibition. The English translations often reach for cult prostitute or sacred prostitute, and while these phrases carry obvious connotations, they flatten something more complex and more troubling than simple commerce. Because what was happening in these temples was not merely transactional, it was theological, it was cosmological. It was understood by the people who practiced it and the priests who administered it as an act of cosmic necessity. The logic went something like this. Ishtar was the source of all fertility, human fertility, animal fertility, the fertility of the land. The union of male and female, when performed within the sacred precincts of her temple, was not mere human desire. It was a reenactment of divine creation. It was a ritual that called down the goddess's blessing upon the fields and the herds and the wombs of the city. The participant was not indulging appetite. They were participating in the maintenance of the cosmos. They were keeping the world alive. This is not a fringe theology. This was mainstream. This was state religion. This was what the ziggurat was built for. And within this system, there were indeed women, some of them powerful. Archaeology has pulled from the earth clay tablets that describe temple women who owned property, who managed assets, who operated with an economic independence that most women in the ancient world could not imagine. In the archive of a temple at Ur, records survive that describe a woman named Amat Shamash, who held title to agricultural land, administered a household of servants, and conducted financial transactions in her own name. She was not marginal. She was prosperous. By the metrics the ancient world used to measure value, she had achieved something remarkable. But, and this is the word that the solemn record of history inserts with terrible weight, but, for every woman who navigated this system and found within it a kind of power, there were women who did not choose it, who were delivered into it, who entered not through vocation, but through debt, through war, through the grinding poverty of families who had run out of other options. The tablets that record the prosperity of the powerful also record, in the same careful cuneiform, the prices paid for those who were not powerful. Young women sold into temple service. The price recorded with the same clinical precision as the price of a draft animal. The same range of silver, the same matter-of-fact accounting. Some of those sold bore marks to ensure they could not leave, not metaphorical marks, physical ones, pressed or burned into the skin of the face. The visible sign of ownership, of a human life converted into a commodity and branded accordingly. This was not the shadow of the system. This was the system, and it was not unique to Mesopotamia. As the centuries moved forward and the cultures of the ancient Near East expanded and interpenetrated, the same basic architecture appeared in Canaan. The worship of Baal and Asherah carried with it similar practices. The high places dotting the hills of the land that would become Israel were not just altars for grain offerings. They were sites of the same merger between sexuality and worship that had been refined over millennia in the river valleys to the east. The Canaanite Kedushot were as embedded in their religious economy as their Babylonian counterparts. When Israel entered the land, they did not encounter primitive superstition. They encountered an ancient, sophisticated, deeply entrenched civilization organized around the premise that their gods demanded this. The law Israel received at Sinai collided with this world like a stone wall. Do not profane your daughter by making her a prostitute, so that the land will not fall to prostitution and the land become full of depravity. The Hebrew of Leviticus is blunt. It does not debate the economics. It does not engage the theology of Ishtar. It simply draws a line and names it sacred. The daughter, not the slave, not the captured woman, not the theological abstraction. The daughter, your daughter, the one whose face you know. The line is drawn around her personhood. around the irreducible humanity of the woman who might otherwise be swallowed by a system that had decided she was useful primarily as a ritual object. The law goes further. The wages of a kedusha were not to enter the treasury of Israel's God. The phrase the Hebrew uses is vivid and unambiguous. It is called the price of a dog. This is not casual contempt for the woman. It is contempt for the system that produced her situation. The money that flows through that institution is contaminated not because of who earned it, but because of what the earning of it required. The exploitation is in the coin. The coin carries the violation with it. God will not accept it, not because he is squeamish, because he refuses to sanctify what the system did to obtain it. And then comes the word kadosh, holiness. In Hebrew, the root means to be set apart, to be different, to be other. Not other in the sense of distant or cold or inaccessible, but other in the sense of operating according to a different logic entirely. Israel's God did not need the union of worshippers in his temple to make the rain fall. He was not sustained by the fertility rituals of his people. He was not, in the terminology of the ancient world, dependent on the cosmic machinery that the Mesopotamian religious system had been built to maintain. He was sovereign over nature. He had made it. He spoke, and it happened. The rains came when he sent them and stopped when he withdrew them, not because a ritual had been correctly performed, but because he had chosen, as an act of his own will and covenant faithfulness, to bless or to withhold. This is the theological earthquake beneath the surface of the Mosaic law. When God says to Israel, "You shall not do this thing that every nation around you does," he's not issuing an arbitrary cultural prohibition. He's dismantling the entire premise on which those nations built their worship. He is saying, the universe does not work the way you think it does. Your fertility is not dependent on what happens in those temples. Your harvests are not purchased by what is done to those women. I am not Ishtar. I am not Baal. And what they require of you, I forbid. Not because it is inconvenient, because it is a lie, and the lie is costing human beings everything. But Israel did not always hold the line. This is where the story deepens. This is where it becomes not merely ancient history, but something more uncomfortable. The record of a people who knew better and chose differently anyway. The erosion did not happen overnight. It never does. It is the nature of spiritual corruption that it moves at the pace of familiarity. The first generation that crossed into Canaan remembered the pillar of fire and the voice from the mountain. The second generation had heard the stories. The third generation had heard the stories of the stories. And by then, the high places on the hills did not look threatening anymore. They looked like the landscape. They looked like what had always been there. The neighbors were not strange. The neighbors were simply neighbors. Their rituals were not alarming. They were just the way things were done. At Shittim, before Israel had even crossed the Jordan, the pattern appeared for the first time in its full and devastating clarity. The men of Israel took Moabite women, and the women brought their gods with them, not secretly, not shamefully, openly, publicly. The worship of Baal Peor entered the camp through the doorways of hospitality and desire, and with it came the practices that accompanied that worship. By the time the text registers what is happening, the corruption has already moved from the margins to the center. Phinehas drives a spear through what he finds, and the plague stops. The act is violent, and the text records it without apology. But the plague had already killed 24,000. The line that was crossed was not merely a cultural preference, it was a threshold. And once crossed, it carried consequences proportional to what had been invested in its maintenance. This pattern became the rhythm of Israel's story in the land. Judges records it with the bleak regularity of a tide. The people would settle. The surrounding culture would begin to press at the edges. The high places would be visited, first secretly, then openly. The Kedeshot would reappear in the land that was supposed to be different. The Baal poles would go up alongside the altars of the Lord. And then a crisis would come, and the people would cry out, and a judge would rise, and the land would have rest, until the next generation allowed the tide to come back in. By the time of the divided kingdom, the corruption had reached its institutional form. This is no longer a matter of individual apostasy hidden in the hills. Under kings like Ahab and Jeroboam, the worship of Baal had become state policy. The prophets who stood against it were not critics of a marginal practice. They were standing against the official religion of the palace, against the priests with salaries and temples, against a system that had now fully integrated the theology of Ishtar with its sacred sexuality, its fertility rituals, its acceptance of the body as a ritual implement into the official worship of a nation that had once stood at Sinai and said yes to a God who demanded something entirely different. The prophets spoke into this. Hosea spoke of it as adultery, not metaphorical adultery. The marriage covenant between God and Israel, entered at Sinai, was being betrayed in the most literal and visible way possible through the very acts performed in those high places. The people had gone after other lovers. The image is sustained and painful throughout Hosea's book, and it is painful precisely because it is not abstracted. He is describing what he watched happen. He is describing the daughters given over, the rituals performed, the system normalized. Isaiah speaks of the blood on hands that are then raised in prayer. Amos speaks of those who drink the wine purchased from fines imposed on the poor. Micah, standing outside Jerusalem, watching the city that was supposed to be the crown of the covenant, speaks of abomination practiced openly in the shadow of the temple. Jeremiah watches the temple itself, the house that bore the name of the God who prohibited all of this, become a location where the prohibited things were done. He uses a word that does not soften or equivocate. He calls it desolation. He says the land itself is defiled, not metaphorically. In the theological world of the Hebrew scriptures, the land responds to what is done upon it. Injustice and idolatry and the violation of persons are not merely human problems. They register in the earth, they accumulate, they build toward a reckoning that once begun does not stop until what cannot be redeemed has been removed and what can be has been purified. The reckoning came, Babylon came. And there is an irony in this so profound that the prophets note it explicitly. The nation that had slowly, generation by generation, incorporated the worship practices of the Mesopotamian world, the nation that had rebuilt in Israelite form the architecture of Ishtar's temples, was carried away to Babylon itself, to the source, to the city where the ziggurat stood and the system ran at full operation. It was as if history had looked at the imitation and said, "You want the original? Here it is. You can see now what you were building toward." The exile was not merely punishment. The prophets who had warned of it and the prophets who interpreted it from within it describe something more surgical than punishment. They describe it as severance, the cutting away of what had fused over centuries into the living tissue of the nation. The idols could not travel with the exiles to Babylon because the idols were connected to the land, to the high places, to the poles, to the local shrines that had become as natural as the hills they sat on. Remove the people from the land, and the idols lose their grip. The exile accomplished in decades what the warnings had not accomplished in generations, and in Babylon, surrounded by the full, operating, unashamed version of what Israel had been drifting toward, something crystallized in the people who remained faithful. The books were gathered, the Torah was read with new urgency. The synagogue emerged, the gathering around the word rather than the altar, around the text rather than the ritual site. Because when everything else was stripped away, what remained was the word, and the word had been saying, from the beginning, "You were made for more than this." The exile ended, the return happened, and the men who came back from Babylon came back changed. The archaeology of the Second Temple period shows something striking. The idols that were everywhere in pre-exilic Israelite sites are largely absent from post-exilic ones. The household figurines, the small clay asherahs, the localized fertility images that appear in the strata of nearly every Israelite site before the exile, they disappear. The people who went into Babylon came back, most of them, without the thing that had sent them there. This is what redemption looks like at the scale of a civilization, not the eradication of the temptation. The temptation remained, and other forms of it would surface in later centuries. But a particular form of it, the one that had been most seductive because it wore the face of worship, because it dressed exploitation in sacred robes and called the violation of persons a cosmic necessity, That form was broken, not by argument, by experience, by the bitter education of living inside the thing you had been slowly becoming and discovering that it was not what you wanted after all. The story does not end in the ancient world. It cannot, because the pattern it describes is not located in a specific geography or a specific century. The pattern is located in something the Hebrew scriptures call the human heart, a phrase that in that literature carries all the weight of what modernity might call motivation, desire, the deepest organizing principle of a person or a people. And the human heart has not changed. The temples changed their architecture. The gods changed their names. The rituals changed their aesthetics. But the fundamental transaction, the conversion of persons into instruments of appetite, the dressing of exploitation in the language of the sacred or the necessary or the inevitable, the system that finds a way to call the powerful benefactors and the powerless grateful, this did not disappear with the fall of Nineveh or the decline of Babylon. It relocated, it adapted, it found new vocabularies and new institutional forms. It still does, and so does the resistance to it. Because alongside the pattern of corruption, the biblical record preserves a counter-pattern, one that is, if anything, more surprising than the corruption itself. It is the pattern of the ones the system tried to consume who were not consumed. Rahab, the woman of Jericho who lived in the wall of a city marked for judgment, hid the spies of Israel and tied a scarlet cord in her window. She is not a footnote. She is in the genealogy of Christ. Tamar, who was denied what was owed to her by a system that had decided she was expendable, dressed herself as what the system understood and used the system's logic to obtain justice. She too is in that genealogy. Ruth, the Moabite widow who had no claim on the covenant and every reason to return to her own people and their gods, said instead, "Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." She too, the God of the Hebrew scriptures, has a habit, visible, consistent, unmistakable across the whole arc of the narrative, of reaching into the places where the system has discarded people and pulling from those very places the thread that continues the story. The ones the high places consumed, he restores. The ones the institution branded and traded and used and forgot, he remembers by name. This is not a sentiment. It is a theological claim with historical weight. It is the claim that the dignity the system denied was never actually extinguished, because it was not the system's to give or take. It was written into the person before the system existed, and the God who wrote it in did not forget what he had written. In this exploration, we have walked through the gates of the ancient world without flinching. We have seen what the tablets record and what the archaeology confirms. We have seen how a civilization built on sophistication and beauty also built, with the same hands and the same intelligence, a structure that consumed the vulnerable and called it holy. We have seen how the law given at Sinai named that consumption for what it was and drew around the person, the daughter, the son, the stranger, a boundary that no commerce and no theology was permitted to cross. We have seen how that boundary was tested and eroded and violated across the centuries, and what the consequences of that erosion looked like. And we have seen, in the midst of the judgment, the mercy that ran beneath it like an underground river, patient, persistent, surfacing in the least expected places to bring to light what the system had tried to bury. The names changed. The hunger did not. But neither did the grace. The question the ancient world leaves at our feet is not an academic one. It is not a matter for scholars or historians alone, though they have much to contribute. It is the question that presses against every generation that looks clearly at the world it has inherited and asks, what are we calling sacred that we should be calling what it is? What systems have we learned to call inevitable that the oldest book in the world named, with precise and unsparing language, as a choice? And behind that question, the deeper one. The one that the scarlet cord in Rahab's window and the line in Ruth's speech and the placement of Tamar's name in the first chapter of the New Testament all point toward, is there a God who sees what the system does to people and does not look away? The record says yes. It has always said yes. It said it in the dust of Babylon, and the ash of Jerusalem, and the long silence of the exile, and the slow, stubborn return. It says it still. If this exploration stirred something in you, if walking through this ancient world with open eyes moved you toward questions you want to keep pursuing, stay with us, subscribe, and keep walking through the depth of Scripture together.